All right, Michelle, are you ready to start?
Yep.
All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce Michelle Montague. Michelle Montague is a professor at UT Austin. She recently wrote a fantastic book called The Given Experience and Its Content, which is available on OUP, came out in 2016. She has also edited 3 volumes, correct? Yes. Non-propositional intentionality, which came out in 2018, co-edited with Alex. Could you pronounce that name for me, please?
Grzynkowski.
Grzynkowski. Thank you. I think I can do that.
Schenkowski.
And also a very nice collection for anyone interested in this topic, Cognitive Phenomenology, co-edited with Tim Bain. Found that very helpful to myself when I started working on some of this stuff. And Philosophical Writings by P.F. Strawson, which is co-edited with Galen Strawson, which came out, that was a while back, I guess, in 2011, and has done all sorts of work in philosophy of mind, specializing in cognitive phenomenology, sense and cognition, and some very interesting work on Franz Brentano. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Montague.
Thanks, David, for inviting me. And I did meet John. I gave a paper at the University of Memphis a long time ago, I think in 2011. And I was just remembering Deb asked me a question about the compositionality of cognitive phenomenology, because I was arguing for its existence with respect to conscious thought. And I remember John telling me not to be too worried about that, that he didn't see any reason that it could be compositional, but maybe, I don't know, John, Terry, if John held that view or he was, anyway, it was very helpful. And his work, along with Terry's work, was instrumental in sort of changing the whole direction of my work on intentionality, because I wrote my dissertation on intentionality, but I was very focused on the sort of inferential relations between contents of propositional attitudes. And so doing all this intentional logic stuff, and then I started reading other people's work on intentionality. I attended a conference in Santa Cruz on consciousness and intentionality, and I just realized that, or I learned that there was this whole different way of thinking about intentionality, and it completely changed the trajectory of my work. And so I have a lot to be thankful for, that John had contributed so much to philosophy of mind and to a change of direction in philosophy of mind. So today I'm going to give a somewhat historical paper on intentionality. I'm not a historian, but I have really learned a lot about philosophy of mind from Franz Brentano. And so in this paper, I'm going to focus on intentionality, and I'll start with the claim that, of course, it's central to our mental life, whether we're concerned with the physical world or pure mathematics, and whether or not we accept Brentano's famous claim that intentionality is the mark of the mental. Surely we can all agree to its centrality to our mental life. And I think that it's useful to start with just the simple characterization that Terry had mentioned at the end of his presentation, that intentionality can be characterized simply as a phenomenon of something's being about or of something, in the sense of a picture being of a battle or a landscape. And I think once we accept that characterization of intentionality as involving aboutness, it's a really small step to appeal to the notion of directness and the idea that an adequate characterization of intentionality must involve this notion of directedness. And then it's just another, I think, small step from there to say that the idea of intentional directedness naturally carries with it the idea of relationality. So to be intentionally directed towards something is essentially or necessarily to be related to it in some manner. So understanding the directedness of intentionality requires understanding quite generally what it is for something to be related to something. And in particular, what it means for something to be intentionally related to something. So we describe many of our intentionally directed experiences by saying that we see, hear, touch, and think about physical objects and physical properties, tables, chairs, electrons, colors, sounds, shapes. And for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to restrict my attention to perceptions and thoughts about the physical world. And so the proposal that I'm going to consider in this paper is that we can only fully understand what intentional relatedness is. We can only fully understand what one can perfectly well call the metaphysics of intentional relatedness in any particular case, if we also have, in that case, an adequate general conception of the metaphysical status of the things which our intentional states are directed towards. So in the case of being directed at the physical world, we can only understand intentional relatedness by having an adequate metaphysical conception of the physical world. So just for a contrast for what I have in mind, suppose we're looking at or thinking about bats and balls conceived in a Kantian way. And then suppose alternatively that we are looking at or thinking about bats and balls conceived in a common sense realist way. What should we say about the metaphysics of the intentional relatedness in these two cases? So that kind of question is really forming the backbone of my thought with respect to this talk. And so what I have in mind to do today is to compare what many contemporary theories of intentionality say about relatedness, intentional relatedness, with what I think Brentano ends up saying about what intentional relatedness consists in. So many theories of intentionality, whether they're common sense realist or irrealist, internalist or externalist, construe intentional relations and relations generally as relating two or more wholly independently existing items. So for the purposes of thought and perception about the physical world, the independently existing items the subject is related to include properties, whether or not they're instantiated or not. And I'm going to focus on properties today, although of course we're in thinking and perceiving the world, we're perceiving objects, but I'm going to focus on properties. So consider a visual experience as of a red ball. So how do different contemporary theories analyze that kind of experience? So I've called David Chalmers, an irrealist internalist. And that's because he thinks redness and roundness as we experience them, what Chalmers calls Edenic redness, Edenic roundness, they're not instantiated in our world. Rather, they are uninstantiated properties to which subjects stand in relations. So in seeing a red round ball, we may stand in relations to surface reflectant properties or quantum mechanical properties, but these are nothing like the redness and roundness that are apparent in our experience. So the redness and the roundness that are apparent in our experience, according to Chalmers, are these Edenic redness, Edenic roundness, and those are uninstantiated properties. They are not instantiated in our world. Don't worry about veridicality because he has a story about how to diagnose that. Okay, so the position I'm going to call common sense realist internalist is, I think, the one that Terry would have, and it would go something like this. Although redness is not instantiated in our world, sometimes spatial properties are, and so subjects can stand in relations to instantiated spatial properties, or if hallucinating, stand in relations to uninstantiated spatial properties. And then you get a common sense realist externalist position like that of Dretsky and Tai, and they say redness and roundness are instantiated in our world, and it is in virtue of interacting with these properties that we come to represent them. Redness is typically identified with a particular surface reflectance property, and roundness with a complex quantum mechanical property. And in the case of hallucination, at least according to Tai, we stand in relations to uninstantiated universals or properties, uninstantiated properties. So I just not so much want to get into the details of these different views, but I want to point out that according to many theories of intentionality, contemporary theories of intentionality, they are understanding intentional relatedness in a certain way as relating the subject to some kind of independently existing property. And then they differ with respect to what they think that is. But today, I want to explore Brentano's theory of intentionality. And part of the reason is because I love him. And I think that he offers an alternative to these standard kinds of contemporary theories. So Brentano's position, and this is not totally without controversy. So I'm sure Sean knows this. So this is sort of one interpretation of Brentano. Brentano's position starts from a Neo-Kantian metaphysics about the physical world. And it is against this background that he develops his theory of intentionality. And I say Neo-Kantian because Brentano was not a full-blown Kantian. He differed, with respect to certain central issues. But it's what I'm emphasizing here is that in order to understand Brentano's theory of intentionality, I think that you have to understand that he's developing it and articulating it against the backdrop of this Neo-Kantian metaphysics. And now I find Brentano's theory particularly interesting for two reasons, at least two reasons. First, what I'll try to show today and argue today is that it makes us rethink the notion of relationality. It questions the assumption that all genuine relations must relate independently existing items. Now, this is not to give up on the idea that intentionality is relational, or on the idea of relationality more generally. Rather, it encourages a new conception of relations that doesn't necessarily entail this feature of independent existence of the relata. So the question is, what does it take to count as a relation? And then once, the second thing that I like about Brentano's theory is once we get this notion of relation that Brentano has in mind clear, we can see how his theory provides a version of phenomenal intentionality theory. And in fact, I think that Brentano ends up saying all intentionality is phenomenal intentionality. So he would be in the camp with David and Cotty, and I guess Angela Mendelevici would be in that camp too. So that's sort of just the general summary of what I'm up to. And so the general structure of the talk will just be first, I'm going to give an overview of Brentano's Neo-Kantian metaphysics. And then I'm going to introduce Brentano's theory of intentionality and the notion of relation that it employs. And then I'll outline the sense in which Brentano is a phenomenal intentionality theorist. Okay, so, and there is a handout that I made available to people, yeah. So Brentano starts his theorizing about reality with the notion of physical phenomena and lists as physical phenomena colors, sounds, shapes, spatial location. But you have to be careful here because it is of first importance to emphasize that Brentano is using phenomena in its original sense to mean appearances. So although you might think that he's articulating some sort of common sense realist view by listing those properties under the category of physical phenomena, that's not what he's doing at all. So here's physical phenomena are appearances, and here's a quote. The words, quote, the words phenomenon or appearance are often used in opposition to things which really and truly exist. We say, for example, that the objects of our senses, as revealed in sensation, are merely phenomena. Color and sound, warmth and taste do not really and truly exist outside of our sensations, even though they may point to objects which do so exist, end quote. So from this quote, there may be something which really and truly exists outside of our sensations, but it's not colors and sounds and shapes and tastes and motion as we experience them. physical phenomena are appearances, and so are actually mental goings on in our present day sense. So if physical phenomena are appearances, what are they appearances of? And Brentano takes a Neo-Kantian line of a sort that was widespread in his time when he says that, and this is a quote, "The phenomena of light, sound, heat, spatial location, and locomotion are not something which really and truly exist. They are signs of something real, which, through its causal activity, produces presentations of them in us. They are not, however, an adequate representation of this reality, and they give us knowledge of it only in a very incomplete sense. We can say that there exists something which, under certain conditions, causes this or that sensation. We can probably also prove that there must be relations among these realities similar to those manifested by spatial phenomena, shapes, and sizes. But this is as far as we can go. We have no experience of that which truly exists in and of itself, and that which we do experience is not true. The truth of physical phenomena is, as they say, only a relative truth," end quote. So on this view, then, the intrinsic nature of reality, that which truly exists in and of itself, which I will call all R for short, insofar as we're concerned with the physical world, is unknown to us. R causes presentations of physical phenomena in us, but its intrinsic nature is unknown to us. But I think that it's important. So we can see that that Brentano has this Kantian metaphysics going on, and so sound and spatial properties, as they appear in our perceptions and thoughts, may not tell us about the intrinsic nature of reality. But I do think it's important to point out that it's possible for Brentano's Neo-Kantian view to capture several senses of objectivity that we associate with the physical world. And this is because the array of physical phenomena, the array of appearances, exhibits a certain causal relational structure that we can infer is similar to or corresponds to the relational structure R has. And because we have that kind of correspondence, structural correspondence between the array of physical appearances and R, we can say that the causal relational structure remains the same for any human experiencing subject, that it remains the same unobserved by any Strawson's emphasis on characterizing objective particulars as unperceived continued existences, so things that can exist while we're not perceiving them. We can still capture that notion for any particular subject that's going to continue to exist when I'm not perceiving it. And finally, that this the causal structure remains the same for any experiencing subject. And I think that this will capture a lot of what we mean by objectivity. And I just wanted to point out that this is the kind of sense of objectivity that Nagel points to when in What It's Like to Be a Bat, when he is talking about lightning and the sense in which it can have an objective character that's not exhausted by its visual appearance, and that this objective character can be investigated by the Martian who doesn't have vision. And the reason that it's objective, the reason that the Martian can investigate this objective character is because the objective character, part of what it is the causal relations, the general causes and effects that that lightning exhibits. So presumably the Martian has to have some kind of conscious access to lightning. And the idea is that this specific effect R has on our species is the specific kind of phenomenal character we experience. And the specific effect R could have on an alien species could be, and very probably would be, a different phenomenological character. But characterizing more general effects that can remain the same across human and alien phenomenology is what natural sciences do. Natural sciences tell us about the more general effects of lightning. So, and I also think that the similarities of these causal relational structures across humans and aliens explain why mathematics is so apt at capturing the relational structure of reality. It's abstract enough to capture relational structure in a purely formal way, devoid of any specific phenomenological content. That's the basic idea of the Neo-Kantian picture that is in the background. So now I'm going to turn to Brentano's theory of intentionality. Now I've characterized, and he characterizes physical phenomena as mental goings-on in our present day sense, their appearances. And although he characterizes them in this way, he famously distinguishes between physical phenomena, sounds, shapes, and colors, and mental phenomena, thinking of red, hearing middle C, and seeing a red round ball in terms of intentionality. So his famous, so what everybody knows about Brentano is that he says all and only mental phenomena are intentional. Physical phenomena exhibit nothing like it. So here we have the introduction of the notion of intentionality into Brentano's worldview. He uses that notion to distinguish physical phenomena from mental phenomena. So now we can ask, what is Brentano's theory of intentionality in light of his Neo-Kantianism? So mental phenomena, such as thinking of red and seeing a red round ball, are intentionally directed towards physical phenomena. And so by our initial understanding of intentionality, are intentionally related to such phenomena. So according to Brentano, however, physical phenomena are appearances, and appearances are mental items in our present day sense. So what subjects' intentional states are directed towards does not exist independently of subjects. It follows that if intentionality is to be relational on Brentano's account, it can't be a matter of relating to independently existing items. So when I think of a red round ball, or I see a red round ball, the red round ball is itself an appearance, but that is precisely what my intentional state is about or related to. So it can't be the case if Brentano's theory is relational. It can't be a matter of relating to independently existing items. His Neo-Kantianism rules that out. So in what sense can Brentano's theory be considered a relational theory? So I think the key for understanding how Brentano's view can capture the relationality of intentionality is to begin with a maximally wide conception of relationality, one that starts with the most comprehensive description possible. Well, plainly a relation is something that relates or connects, and we can picture this kind of connection by thinking of a relation as having two or more slots that must be filled. Now, this general description applies to all possible relations: causal, intentional, spatial, temporal, mereological, comparative, and so on. In the case of being in an intentional state, for example, having something as intentional object is the way the subject is connected or related to the object. The essential point is that in describing or conceiving of the intentional state, one must discern at least two slots, one for the subject and one for what the subject is thinking about, the object. Similarly, being in effect a shattered window is the way an object is connected to or related to another object, a rock. In describing or conceiving of the causal relation in this instance, one must discern two slots, one for the cause and one for the effect. And this kind of pattern is exhibited by all of the relations. The key point here is simply that this general characterization of relations says nothing about the metaphysical status of what fills the relational slots. The idea is that what makes something a relation is not dependent on the metaphysical status of what fills the slots. And so by taking this sort of maximally wide conception of relation, we can capture all of what appears to be relational on Brentano's theory. And now we can see why his theory of intentionality is an alternative to the standard aforementioned contemporary relational theories. So whereas they characterize the relation as relating to independently existing items, just cutting down to bare bones, a subject and some properties, whether those are instantiated or not, Brentano offers us a conception of relationality, which it captures his theory of intentional relation without the metaphysical burden of saying that the relata must be independently existing. So now I want to turn to why Brentano's theory is a phenomenal intentional theory. So two of the hallmarks of phenomenal intentionality, as Terry's been telling us, is that one is that intentionality is wholly internal or intrinsic to the subject. I guess I should say that needs to be qualified, because if you make a distinction between narrow and wide, it will only apply to narrow intentionality. And the second hallmark is that phenomenology wholly determines or is identical to intentionality. Now, Brentano's theory satisfies one trivially because physical phenomena are appearances, and the only appearances which can be given to me in such a way that I can stand in an intentional relation to them are appearances to me, appearances in my own mind. So they're obviously intrinsic to the subject. Now, to see why Brentano's theory satisfies two, why does phenomenology entail intentionality? I want to consider again the example of having a visual experience as of a red round ball. So one, this visual intentional state is about redness and roundness. This is just true by description. Now, again, I should add that there are many other things that this intentional state's about: physical objecthood, location in space, but I'm just simplifying to redness and roundness. Redness and roundness, so number two, redness and roundness are appearances. This just follows from Brentano's Neo-Kantianism. Three, since appearances are essentially mental in our present day sense and conscious, they are also essentially phenomenological. And I take this just to be by definition of consciousness. Four, what this visual intentional state is about is phenomenological. That follows from 1 and 3. So the phenomenological determines the intentional insofar as it determines what an intentional state is about. So here we have the basic idea that Brentano's theory is offering a phenomenal intentionality theory. So you might wonder at this point if even on Brentano's theory, our intentional states can in some sense reach out to and thus be related to R, the intrinsic nature of reality. It is part of Brentano's theory that it is in virtue of causally interacting with R that R causes sensations in us. Although there may be a sense in which we can say that our intentional states are related to R, it would be infelicitous on the terms of his theory to describe them as intentionally related to R. So I think this makes it the case that Brentano's theory, according to Brentano's theory, all intentionality is phenomenal intentionality. That's all there is to it. So just to try to elucidate that claim a little bit, I want to go back to the question of how Brentano distinguishes mental from physical phenomenon. And I think part of it has to do with the intentionality of mental phenomena is phenomenologically evident from our own experience of it. So in psychology from empirical standpoint, Brentano makes the claim all the data of our consciousness are divided into two great classes, the classes of physical and the class of mental phenomena. So since mental and physical phenomena are appearances, both of them are appearances, and appearances are phenomenologically present to subjects, both mental and physical phenomena are phenomenologically presented to subjects. Now, I should mention here, although mental phenomena for Brentano are appearances, they are more than just appearances, because mental phenomena reveal themselves for intrinsically for what they are. And this is one of the ways in which he really differs from Kant. Although physical phenomena don't, reveal any intrinsic nature about the world, mental phenomena reveal exactly what they are. But both of them are appearances, according to him. They're phenomena. So because appearances are essentially phenomenological, you can distinguish you distinguish mental phenomena from physical phenomena in virtue of intentionality. Intentionality is itself phenomenologically evident in having a mental phenomena, in having the experience of a mental phenomena. So the idea is that intentional directness is itself phenomenologically detected by the subject, and it is in terms of this intentional directedness that mental and physical phenomena are categorically distinguishable. Now, since intentionality concerns what our intentional states are about, and what they are about in the case of thinking about the physical world are physical phenomena such as colors, sounds, and shapes, it is physical phenomena that are phenomenologically given as data of consciousness and not transcendent reality. So although we may wish to say that features of R are also given, albeit indirectly, when physical phenomena such as colors, sounds, and shapes are given, and that we thereby stand in intentional relation to features of R, this is no part of Brentano's picture. Physical phenomena are phenomenologically given as the objects of mental phenomena, and it is this kind of phenomenological object givenness that is intentionality. So although intentional states may stand in some relation to R, on Brentano's view, they are not intentionally related to R. So that pretty much sums up Brentano's view, and I wanted to present it today because I think it presents a interesting alternative theory of intentionality alternative to the standard conceptions of intentional theories. And it does so by really looking at this notion of relation and the way in which this notion of relation comes into play in thinking about the metaphysical structure of intentional states. And it sort of widens, if you take his view seriously, it widens our conception of a relation in such a way that we can see the sense in which Brentano's theory is a relational theory of intentionality. And so part of the reason this is interesting is because there's a lot of debate about whether or not Brentano got himself into trouble in psychology from an empirical standpoint, and whether or not he could really hang on to a notion of relationality when thinking about intentionality. And I think we can see how he can do it in this kind of interesting, novel way if we expand our notion of relation by thinking about what we could possibly mean by relationality against the backdrop of a Kantian metaphysics. So that's it. That's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you very much, Michelle. Now, just to give you the format for the rest of the talk, so we will be going till 1 o'clock, given that we started a little bit late. What'll be happening next is Zach Neiman will be commenting. Michelle Montague will have a chance to respond, and then we'll open it up to general questions. If you have a question, just send me, you don't have to send the question, just send me a quick chat so I can make a list. And just to make sure we get as many questions as possible, let's limit follow-ups to just one follow-up per person, if that's okay with Michelle. And yeah, so let's go ahead. So now Zach will be giving his comments.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for a very interesting talk. I certainly learned a lot from it. So what I'm going to do is briefly summarize Michelle's talk, and then I'm going to ask a series of 3 questions about it. So Michel's aim is to understand Brentano's view of the intentional relation. In order to do that, we must have an understanding of the metaphysical status of the relata of intentionality, so as to have a full comprehension of intentional relatedness. She explains that there are broadly three ways that philosophers understand the intentional relation, what she calls irrealist internalist, common sense realist internalist, and common sense realist externalist. What unites them is that they all take the intentional relation to be between a subject and an object out there in the world. Michel argues that Brentano offers an alternative from these views. Brentano holds Neo-Kantian metaphysics, according to which phenomenal appearances are only signs that are causally induced from an ultimately unknowable intrinsic reality. For Brentano, only mental phenomena are intentional. Mental phenomena refer not to direct presentations like color and sound, which he calls physical phenomena, but something like a higher order perception or cognition that I am seeing a color or that I'm hearing a sound. Mental phenomena are intentionally related to physical phenomena. Hence, the relata of intentionality are not between a subject and an external object, but rather between mental and physical phenomena within the subject. Brentano's theory of intentionality amounts to two claims. Intentionality is wholly internal or intrinsic to the subject, and phenomenology wholly determines intentionality. The Brentanian theory, as Michel outlines it, takes a strong phenomenal intentionality thesis. All intentional states are phenomenal intentional states. So let me begin with the first question. On Brentano's view, the intentional relation is not between phenomenal states and real objects in the world, it's between phenomenal states alone. We can contrast this claim with Searle's view. So Searle argues that the view that intentional states are about perceptual states rests upon a fallacious ambiguity. The intentional relation can be expressed as such, and I'm going to type this in the chat. So subject S has an awareness A of object O. That's how Searle puts it. So, but if the intentional object is a phenomenal state, then this statement rests upon an ambiguity. It would imply that the awareness A and the object O are different, yet O as a phenomenal state just is a kind of awareness. That is just what it means to be a phenomenal state. You're aware of it. Given that A equals O, or at least that O is a proper subset of A, then the view that intentional states are about perceptual states amounts to the tautological claim that the subject is aware of an awareness. If Searle is right, then Brentano is in hot water. Now, one way out of this might be to defend the idea that awareness of awareness is not viciously tautological, as Searle claims. And I think this is something that you've already defended in your book, The Given. But what I'd like to know is, how would you respond to a Searlean style critique of Brentanian intentionality? Is there a way to get out of this claim that this relation rests upon an ambiguity? For the second question, so I'm going to make a broadly naturalist assumption that phenomenal intentionality is ultimately physically realized by neural computations. So the question is, how would a biophysical system realize Brentanian intentionality? And I mean this question as a practical one. I don't mean to imply any kind of austere physicalist reductionism. I would take it as an argument against Brentanian intentionality if we could not give a plausible way that it could be computationally realized, even if it were the case that phenomenal states are not completely reducible to computational states. My first impression is that attempting to naturalize Brentanian intentionality would pose a challenge to the thesis that phenomenology fully determines intentionality. Here's why. If phenomenology fully determines intentionality, then that means intentional relations are founded in phenomenology. This gives a special functional or causal power to consciousness that non-conscious cognition therefore does not have. Assuming that phenomenal consciousness is in some sense realized by functional consciousness. In other words, assuming a naturalistic world in which phenomenology emerges from neural computation instead of being some mysterious dualist property, then that would mean that functional consciousness has a special functional or causal power to create intentional relations. Many of the most prominent theories of consciousness in cognitive neuroscience, including global workspace theory, attention schema theory, and integrated information theory, do not give consciousness any special power like that, however. In global workspace theory and integrated information theory, functional consciousness has one functional power that non-conscious cognition lacks: global availability or global integration. In intention schema theory, consciousness's unique functional power is being a schema of the brain's attentional processes. None of these scientific theories of consciousness would allow for the special functional power that Brentanian intentionality would seem to necessitate, namely that conscious cognition can create special intentional relations between cognitive contents. So my initial impression is that trying to naturalize Brentanian intentionality in a biophysical system using the resources of cognitive neuroscience would pose a challenge to his theory. Do you think that there is a successful way that we could naturalize Brentanian intentionality, or is it a hopeless task once we think about naturalizing it, how it would work in a brain, basically? And for my final question, so you present Brentano's view as an interesting counter to contemporary views of the intentional relation. But finding something interesting and agreeing with it are certainly very different things. Do you regard Brentano's theory as merely an interesting alternative view of phenomenal intentionality, or are there aspects of it that you agree with? And I think you've kind of gestured towards what's interesting. It's the relational aspect, but I'd like to hear more about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach, for your comments. Lots to think about. I'm just thinking where to start. Maybe I'll start with the last or the second question, because, okay, so part of what interested me about Brentano's theory, Brentano himself was a dualist, but I don't think it has to have that implication. Part of what interested me about it is that it leaves open what the intrinsic nature of reality actually is. It doesn't take a stand on it. And so I take this to be a positive because it leaves open the possibility of a panpsychist view. And so what would be the intrinsic nature of reality would also be consciousness, some form of consciousness. And so insofar as you think that there are good arguments for panpsychism, I found Brentano's theory really interesting as a way to put a theory of intentionality together with that kind of view. And because, okay, so that sort of goes some way to answering your last question too, like something that I would find positive about it. And then I don't think if you think about it like that, I don't think, sort of the project of naturalizing is at all problematic for Brentano, because if you think about neurophysiology and it's describing the causal nexus of our brain, that all can stand just as it is. And Brentano would accept all of that. It would just be that, well, the intrinsic nature of the neurophysiological states would be conscious states according to panpsychism. So I don't think he would have a problem with the naturalization. It really depends on what you mean by naturalization too. So I don't think, and yeah. So that's part of what I think of questions 2 and 3. And so the part of what got me interested in this theory too, as actually a plausible alternative rather than just, oh, this is neat, look at this, is Adam Pautz. He's written this article that just came out in the Block paper, and he's really pressing the point that having intentional states related to spatial properties is going to be particularly problematic for certain kinds of internalist views, because you're supposed to be having, according to phenomenal internalist views, intentionality determined by internal features of the subject, but spatial thoughts and perceptions seem to require a relation to something outside of the subject, and how is the internalist going to account for that? And so I thought that got me thinking about this notion of relation in more detail. And I thought, well, Brentano's theory actually answers Adam's worries. It provides an internalist theory that will not have a problem with accounting for our perceptions and thoughts about space because of how he conceives of relations. Whereas he particularly is pressing Terry on his view about spatial, how are you going to how are you going to give an internalist account of perception of space? Now for Chalmers, it's not a problem because he also is an irrealist. So he doesn't think that the spatial properties as we experience them are instantiated. So we're just related to uninstantiated properties. And so he's not gonna have a problem with the spatial perceptions. So then it becomes, what's a more plausible account, something like Chalmers or something like Brentano's theory. And so it does start carving up a little space where it looks like it has some benefits. And also you might think a lot of these theories start talking about being related to uninstantiated properties. And it doesn't have that sort of view it doesn't have what you might think implausibility. Some people think that's implausible. It doesn't have that implausibility. So I do think there are some things that you can say in its favor. Now, Searle. Well, one thing I want to just point out, when you start off question one by saying the intentional relation is not between phenomenal states and real objects in the world, I think we really need to be careful about what we think real and external and independent and objective are actually doing, because I think there's a sense in which Brentano does think there's a sense in which perceptions are to external objects. He calls it external perception. It's just you have to be very careful about the metaphysics of external. That's why I had the part in my paper where I tried to show that according to Brentano's theory, it could account for these features of objectivity that we think are important for what the physical world is. So I just wanted to say we need to be careful about that. But yeah, it's, Brentano has an awareness of awareness theory of consciousness. So it's true. He says mental phenomena, you're aware of the physical phenomena and you're aware of the mental phenomena itself as a whole. So he's not going to find Searle's schema threatening or in any way. I'm not sure what else I have to say. Maybe I'll stop there and let other people talk.
All right, thank you. I'm keeping my video off because my connection is getting a little dodgy, but so our order of questions is David Pitt, then Rob Hoveman, and then Bronwyn Stipa. So David, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That was really excellent. I really, really enjoyed it. So in thinking about I guess you were saying that Brentano thinks that relationality is sort of the essence of intentionality. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I was thinking of this paper, in Uriah's volume, paper by Chris Fry called Phenomenal Presence. And the lesson that I learned from that paper, whether he was teaching it or not, but what I got from that paper was the idea that even more fundamentally, intentionality is about a distinction between self and non-self.
Interesting.
So when things are presented as not me, right, that's sort of the the essence of intentionality. And I find that idea really, really interesting. He doesn't cite Brentano. I don't know if Brentano thought anything like it. And so as I was thinking about asking this question, whether that's an even deeper level of explanation, it occurred to me, well, but I can think about myself. And so maybe that's not the right way to think of it. But then when self becomes an object to itself, yeah. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about any of that.
I think that's a really interesting proposal, and I've tried running that line a long time ago. I tried giving a paper, and it was not, it was sort of saying, well, fundamentally, there's some distinction between subject and what's not the subject, and that sort of distinction and difference is what grounds intentionality. But your question about thinking of yourself is a good one, and was thinking of your arm. I don't know, so that seems problematic because that's part of myself, but I'm thinking of my arm, and that's surely a form of intentionality. So I'm not sure if that.
Well, I don't think my arm is, my arm isn't identical to myself.
No, but
but myself is identical to myself.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah, right. So your example would be even harder. Yeah, I do think there's something.
But I think there's something really, really interesting about that.
I do too. I do. I really think so too. But I just never quite saw how to carry it out. Because even if you think of an experience like pain, there seems to be a distinction between you and the pain. It's not like you're collapsing into it. But I don't know. So I think it's interesting. I don't know. Brentano never talks in that way.
Right, and if you just say at the level of relations, you don't have a problem with thinking about yourself.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were.
I didn't read that one. I didn't read that.
Yeah, it's called Phenomenal Presence. It's in this.
Chris Fry,
F-R-E-Y.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting paper.
Thanks.
All right, Rob Hoveman is next.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, if you hear the sound of fireworks going off, it's not because the English are celebrating the defeat of Donald Trump, but rather celebrating the execution of a Catholic insurrectionary 415 years ago. That's the peculiarities of being in the UK. But just pretty quickly before I go to my question, I'd also like to echo what David said about what a brilliant paper that was, fascinating, and embarrasses me that I don't know more about Brentano because he is obviously a very interesting person. But so I have two questions though. The first is really this. I think I understand what you're saying and what you're saying Brentano is saying about intentional relations to appearances. I just wondered whether his concept of appearances has any affinity with what later became the concept of sense data, at least in certain uses, as it were, objects that are internal to the experience, but which can nonetheless, as it were, be separated out so you can have a relation to that sense datum within the experience, a relation which perhaps we might construe as intentional. And if there is an affinity of that kind, and this brings me to the second question, and intentionality is confined in that way to objects, so to speak, appearances which are internal to experience. For the sense datum theorists of that kind, obviously there are always epistemological problems about how that all relates to a world that is actually independent of us in some sense or other. But if intentionality is confined to such appearances, isn't there a problem of even thinking about, of having any kind of intentional relation to, for example, the causal goings on that are not as it were, features of appearances themselves. I may have completely misunderstood Brentano, and I commit myself to working much harder on trying to understand him. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting that you bring up the sense data comparison, because I hadn't thought of that. But it's true, it has the commonality that new sense data, like Brentano's physical phenomena, are internal to the overall mental phenomena, the overall experience. So it does have that in common, and it does look like it has that subject-object structure, subject relation that the sense data theorists thought that it had. And it just made me think of Russell again, and what he says about what we can know about physical objects, because we can only know them by description, right? So the only thing we can say about them is they are the cause of these sense data or whatever. And so that is also in line with Brentano, because he says the only thing we can say about reality in itself, well, he actually says something a little bit more substantial. He says, well, they cause our sensations, right? The reality in itself causes our sensations. But he also makes the stronger claim that there are these correspondences between structure of the physical array and the structure of the intrinsic reality. So I don't know what Russell would say about that. So yeah, there are those two commonalities, at least that we can't know. We can only know about physical objects by description, which seems to align. Obviously Brentano would not want to call those physical objects, because his physical objects are the appearances. So there's some terminological differences there. Now, so does that make it hard to think about causal goings on? I don't know if this is what you're worried about, but one difference between Kant and Brentano, I don't know that much about Kant. So anybody who knows about something about Kant can step up here. He doesn't think this notion of causation, I think, is problematic for using it. Kant doesn't use it in the way, or help himself in the way that Brentano does. So is there going to be a problem thinking about, are you asking about how we can think about causation itself, or that's what you're asking about?
Yes, I'm thinking about if there are restrictions on the intentional to that which is, so to speak, internal to experience.
Yeah.
How can the intentional ever reach beyond that, even to refer and discuss and hypothesize that which lies beyond the experience itself? That's I think my problem.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. He clearly, sort of helps himself to it, right? But I don't recall him saying anything about why he can help himself to it. So you might think he's being pushed into a even more radical phenomenalism position. So you might think we can. I think, didn't Locke think that we could get a handle on the notion of causation by just observing our own mental goings on? Like somehow there's some oomphy thing we can latch onto in virtue of just, the way my mental relates to the mental. So maybe if you could get causation there, but that still doesn't give you anything about something, sort of completely beyond us, an intrinsic reality completely independent of us. And he does help himself to that. And where does that idea come from? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that he answers that, and I'm not sure what you could say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right. Next we have Bronwyn.
Hi. Thanks, Michelle. So this is a very half-baked, I'm not even sure if it's it's a question, but I don't propose to have any solutions in mind for it, but just a thought. It occurred to me, I'm wondering if one was to develop and adopt this view, what sort of prospects we might have for giving a theory of reference or of truth conditions with this sort of metaphysical underpinning. And I don't know if you've yourself thought about this at all, if there's any resources or if anyone else has any thoughts on, but it's like, I've just myself been thinking about these sort of options in the area, but haven't yet really been led in any one direction. So yeah, that's all. Yeah, just thinking about like a sort of internalist vindication, but something that's more satisfying than like some sort of just really extreme like error theoretic sort of thing, I guess. That's what I'm thinking or wondering thing. So just that.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought that he would have a particular problem, given that sort of, what the physical world is just remains as we typically think of it. And so whatever truth conditions you were going to give for the grass is green will remain the same.
Yeah, I guess the one thing the sticking point is, or maybe it's not a sticking point, but if I think Angela Mengelovici has like pushed this point where she's just like, I know what I mean when I say it, or I know what I'm thinking about. And if, if it turns out that like, if there's some sort of mismatch there, like, oh no, you thought you were talking about like the thing in itself, but you can't really, or you thought you were thinking about, I think talking about actually might be easier, but you can't be thinking about, or to what extent can we be like thinking about the thing in itself, or yeah, I guess is that there seems to be a mismatch there if you're going for like this experience is kind of determinative of the content. There might still be a worry about a mismatch there.
Yeah, I think we have to, I'm really interested in what's involved in our notion of objectivity and independence from experience and external, it's external to all these notions, real, all these notions we use to talk about the physical, this chair in front of me is independent. We say it's independent of my experience. It's external to my experience. And so that's why, I think Brentano needs to do some work to capture some of those intuitions so it doesn't look like our theory is just radical. His theory of intentionality is like a radical mismatch. But I think he can do that. I think he can capture some of what we mean by independence and objectivity. I think he can do that without landing us in a radical mismatch. But I think this, yeah.
I mean, I think I agree. But yes, hence why my question isn't really a question, just more maybe an invitation to the group and later on if anyone has thoughts, because it's something I'm quite interested in.
Mm-hmm.
So. All right. Well, if
John has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who's that?
I do too.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I thought I posed one.
Yeah, if we have time.
Oh, Sean. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to. I was wondering, perhaps, if some of those issues could be resolved. I think basically Brentano was very much influenced by Aristotle. He was influenced by the scholastic medieval tradition, and who inherited an Aristotelian conception of intentionality, which is, I think Brentano's notion of the intentional inexistence of the object in your mind is something like Aristotle's form. We get to know the form, we don't get to know the material stuff itself. So I wonder if there's just a metaphysics like that hovering in the background for Brentano, and that's how he would try to resolve some of those problems.
I'm not sure. See, I think that it depends what we mean by material, because he seems to say that what we typically call physical, sort of sounds, motion, heat, locomotion, space, those would be material properties, right? On sort of just commonsensically. But what those are for him are appearances. And the materiality is sort of an appearance. So I don't know. I mean, that might just be. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know. Sorry about that. I don't know how to operate my machine. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm offering just a different metaphysics from that Aristotelian conception. Because it sounds like there you want to say, well, your intentional state has the form, but the materiality is something that's out there. So it's not in your state.
Yeah, with Aristotle, though, the form is also out there.
Oh, right, okay.
Right? Yeah. We kind of reduplicate it, so to speak, in our mind.
Right. Okay, I see what you mean. So we have identical. So the form is out there and the form is in my intentional state. So there's an identity of form. And what's missing is materiality. But what did Aristotle think that was? I mean...
Prime matter.
Yeah, and so prime matter is like totally unindividuated stuff, isn't it? Like...
It gets individuated by a form, right? This is just, I haven't read Aristotle's Metaphysics for a while, but that's what I remember. Yeah.
No, that sounds right. I think it could. Yeah, so I see what you mean now. I see what you mean. I think it could solve some of these problems because you would get truth conditions in virtue of the form. Is that? And so you wouldn't have to worry. Yeah.
All right, Terry?
Yeah, my worry is similar to what has been raised by several other people, I think, maybe most closely by what Rob Hoveman was saying. Let me just quote a little bit from John Teenson's paper, A Conception of Metaphysics. He says, many philosophers today think, for example, that science tells us how the world is, or at any rate gives us our best bet. Working out the fundamental categories and structure of the world, given the science of the day, is a difficult and controversial matter. Doing so is doing real metaphysics. And he goes on to say that he thinks the world of our ordinary conceptual scheme is not very much like the world science tells us is there. Now, what I'm wondering about is how on this picture that you say you like, we're supposed to think about, let's talk about fundamental physics and its aspirations. I mean, Zach was, in his questions to you, he was wondering whether you can make this picture fit comfortably with neuroscientific realization of phenomenal intentionality. And it sounded like you were wanting to say, no problem, we can leave neuroscience alone and let it keep doing its thing. It fits within this picture. I mean, do you want to say the same about fundamental physics, where the kinds of entities and processes that are posited and theorized about don't seem very close at all to what we would intuitively think of as appearances, including material object appearances, like appearances of tables and chairs and mountains? I take it that on this picture, you should not think that we should really be aspiring with our fundamental science to give us the fundamental categories and structure of the world. We have to either go panpsychist or just embrace a kind of Kant-style skepticism about our inability to know about the fundamental structure of the world. So what do you want to say within this framework about the status of fundamental physical theory, like quantum theory? Is it about appearances only? And how is it about appearances?
Well, that's going to be, that's going to be a problem. Isn't that a problem for everyone? Like, what is the relationship between fundamental physics and the way the world appears? So it depends what you think too, what fundamental physics is offering us. So I don't think that Brentano would disagree that it's describing the structural, relational features of the world. I don't think he would disagree with that. But
if it's describing such things, or if it's aspiring to describe such things, then it sounds like we're talking about ways that intentionality can reach out to the world. This was Rob Hovman's worry. It sounded like on your framework, intentionality can't do that.
Well, what physics does is describe the structure. You could say it describes certain structure. Now, so natural science describes structure, and I think that intentionality can grasp that, because if you think about what he's saying, so we have this physical phenomena, so we have this array of appearances, and those appearances exhibit a structure. And so insofar as those appearances exhibit a structure, it seems like the intentionality could be about that structure. Now, what you're asking about fundamental physics is in what sense is that available for intentional thought, right?
And I'm not sure how much of the structure that it talks about plausibly corresponds to structure within the appearances.
Of fundamental physics.
Yeah, so the structure of black hole collapse, for example, and gravitational waves. I'm not sure, how those are supposed to correspond to the structure of appearances, unless we're going to talk about it in very operationalist terms and say all the real content we have there has to do with the appearances that we have in our measurement device experiences.
Or that could be, that might be one way, or, sort of what we're talking about is certain causal patterns, that we ultimately have to link back to our measurement, sort of how we're detecting those things. So, one of the things that I'm also interested in is, and you brought up Tienson's interest in P.F. Strawson's descriptive revisionary metaphysics, and one of the claims that Strawson makes is that, as you know, material bodies like tables and chairs are the basic particulars in our conceptual scheme, which means that they are the only particulars that we can identify without identifying other particulars. So he considers theoretical posits like so he says our identifying them is dependent on our identifying material objects. And so there's always going to be a link between material objects and the intentionality involved in that and these more theoretical entities. Like they always have to be grounded. They're sort of dependent vis-a-vis identification on material bodies, which is interesting because that does give you a line for saying what kind of intentionality is involved with respect to thinking about those theoretical posits, because it has to be, for Strawson, it has to be the identification works via the basic particulars, material bodies. And so it has to be grounded in that. And so that would be one way, so that would be one way of trying to sort of give some more contemptful way of thinking about what's going on with theoretical posits and our thoughts that involve those theoretical posits. But that's a really, I think that your question about fundamental physics is a much harder one than sort of maybe more higher level sciences. So I might try to go that Strawson route insofar as identification purposes go, because he's talking about thought. That's what he's talking about. How do I identify particulars?
There are aspects of the so-called Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory that you might like in this regard.
Okay, good. I'll look that up. Thank you.
All right, next question.
I guess I'm off the hook.
Yeah, you might be off the hook. Maybe people are getting hungry or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, fantastic. So then,
Yeah, Michelle, it was really great. It was a really wonderful presentation.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks very much for that talk. It was really, really good.
I appreciate your questions a lot, and I will have a lot to think about. Okay, thanks.
So the plan is I will be turning off the Zoom session. We're going to have a break, and we will reconvene at 2:00 Central Standard Time for the first talk will be David Pitt, followed by David Henderson and Terry Horgan. So enjoy your lunches, and I will.
So apparently they're out in the streets honking horns and screaming and celebrating all across the country. So let's do it.
Yeah.
I live in the country, unfortunately, in a probably 80% Trump area. So I'm just going to quietly cheer in my house. But yes, that's good for the urbanites. All right.